Hello, good afternoon. My name is Yunus Hussain. I'm from the South African government, the Department of Trade and Industry. I'm the acting head of investment promotion and facilitation. It's my pleasure to moderate this session this afternoon. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of specialists. Mr. Mike Makuli, who's the CEO of the Green Cape Agency in South Africa. Ms. Ayanda Nakedi, who is the Senior General Manager at our power utility ESCOM, and she's in the Renewable Energy Division. Mr. Vinu Nambia, who is the Senior VP Middle East and Africa SunPower, who's one of the manufacturers in South Africa. Mr. Peter Oldacre, who is the Executive Director of Sub-Saharan Africa for Sky Power in Canada, one of the project developers, and Mr. Anthony Igadoro, who is the chair of the Africa Renewable Energy Alliance. So we have an esteemed panel that has the policy experience and know-how, including the power utility as well as the manufacturer and a project development in South Africa. South Africa, as a background, has an integrated resource plan, of which the renewable energy will come from a quota of our renewable energy will be part of this IRP program. And in the past 4 years, South Africa has a competitive bid process through 4 rounds of bidding. We have procured 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy, of which 4,000 megawatts is connected to the grid. And we will procure another 6,300 megawatts over the next 3 years, leading to a total 17.8 gigawatts of renewable energy. The program has been a very open, transparent program, deep involvement in public participation in its development, started off slowly but moved very fast through the 4 rounds, and has become globally acclaimed today, South Africa becoming one of the largest or most prominent areas for renewable energy investment from UNEP, as well as recognized in the Global Climate Scope report as the 5th most promising destination for renewable energy. The program started off with its key objectives of reducing the carbon footprint, creating jobs, and well as from where it started from round 1 to round 4, very competitive bidding, resulting to a very competitive price. So joining me on the panel, I think each one of the panel members will briefly introduce their company or organization, very short, but give us their experience in terms of the renewable energy program in South Africa, its historical outline and its characteristics today, and then from broad policy perspective, but more importantly from a developer and a manufacturing perspective, as well as how the framework in terms of connecting to the grid and integrating to the grid, and how we see these lessons from South Africa can be replicated or enhanced in other developing economies, but also then in concluding, where do we see the renewable energy program in South Africa? As we said, as quarter of our renewable energy mix, our energy will come from renewable energy, and we are poised as for further significant investment in the renewable energy program. The program in South Africa itself, by and large, has been financed in South Africa, together in the 4 rounds of bids, 190 billion rand of investment, of which only 30% of that is foreign direct investment, so significant. The project itself has been developed in terms of local currency in South Africa and active participation from the banks in South Africa. So I will start off with Mr. Mike Makuli from the Green Cape who's the CEO, as well as running an agency which is purely in terms of our clean tech development in South Africa, will become a special economic zone very shortly in South Africa. So that's how we are ramping up and making clean tech or sustainable investment in South Africa. But Mike, if you can just outline for us the IRP program, particularly with reference to how we have started the renewable energy program in South Africa, and some of the how we've ramped up the program, but more so some of the challenges and how the program has now become globally recognized.
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much, Eunice. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike. Very quickly to introduce the organization that I run. It's called Green Cape. We were set up about 5 years ago, really to try and unlock and unblock opportunities in the green economy in South Africa. We've done a lot of work in policy and regulations. Renewable energy is very new to South Africa, so as you can imagine, lots of the rules and lots of the regulations weren't written with renewable energy in mind. Things like zoning schemes, transportation arrangements, we've done a lot of work in that space. We're also the first African member of the International Clean Tech Network. It's a group of leading clean tech clusters that have been basically set up to try and reinforce each other across the planet. As Eunice mentioned, we're also busy setting up the first green tech special economic zone. That'll be in Cape Town and Atlantis. And we hope to attract inward-bound investment to set up specifically for manufacturing for components. Quickly to touch on the policy side, in COP17 was hosted by South Africa in Durban. There was a number of commitments that South Africa made at that event, and it really was around reducing emissions by 34% by 2020 and then 42% by 2025. The bulk of South Africa's carbon emissions come from our electricity generation system, which is dominated by coal. From that, the integrated resource plan that Eunice was talking about was pulled together, and that allocated 17.8 gigawatts for renewable energies to be procured by 2030. That procurement was then further broken into a couple of chunks. The first chunk was about 3.7 gigawatts. Within 2 years of the program running, that 3.7 gigawatts was already allocated. An additional 6.3 gigawatts was made available, and now just recently there's been another 6.3 gigawatts made available for immediate procurement. We didn't arrive at this system immediately. Right in the beginning, there was an attempt to set up a feed-in tariff in South Africa. After some considered efforts by the Department of Energy and National Treasury, looking and understanding feed-in tariffs from around the world and understanding the policy imperatives of South Africa, it was decided that a competitive bidding system or a reverse auction system would be the most appropriate in South Africa. That reverse auction really works on a basis of 70% being allocated to price and 30% being allocated to economic development criteria. I won't go into too much detail. I think Anthony's going to touch on that. But really, this was an attempt for the South African government to recognize that there were broader imperatives than just getting cheap electricity onto the grid, that a number of social and economic development requirements were made as part of this energy procurement. Very briefly on some of the emerging policy trends that we've seen in South Africa is there's a burgeoning market for small-scale embedded generation. Those are systems underneath a megawatt. Just last year, the numbers have come out. There was close to 80 megawatts of rooftop systems that were installed in South Africa. About 25 of that was installed within the city of Cape Town. And really, we anticipate that this is a market that will grow increasingly into the future. There are a number of small regulatory issues that are being worked through by the government and by industry. I think to touch on Eunice's last question, the big point is that in South Africa 6 years ago there was nothing. Now there's a successful, replicable program that's built a huge amount of confidence in both the private sector and the public sector. It is delivering cheap electricity. it's delivering local ownership, it's delivering local manufacturing, and it's delivering against socioeconomic and community development imperatives in the country. I think very last point that I'll make is that this is the outcome that we've arrived at now. Where we started with the first round of bidding, the projects were much more expensive. They were standalone ring-fence project finance installations. And over time, as the confidence has grown in the industry in South Africa, you've seen a reduction in the bidding price round on round. In nominal terms, those prices have decreased by 75% in PV and about 45% in wind. And in real terms, it's more like 80 and 50% across those two technologies. But I think that's probably more than my 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Anthony, who's the chair of the Renewable Energy Alliance, what is your view on South Africa's Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program, and how has the program evolved?
Well, I'm chair of the African Renewable Energy Alliance, which is it's a civil society organization made up of over 2,000 members from 98 countries, and half those countries are from Africa. And although we are registered in South Africa, most of our members, South African members, only account for 10%. So we think we take a holistic view of this situation. About 60% of our members come from business, 15% from academia, and 15% civil society, and 8 to 10% policy. Now, when we think what lessons are there to learn from South Africa, the basic question is, can renewable energy deliver at speed and pace? From the point of view of Nigeria, I think 2 years ago they had a plan, presidential plan for energy build-up right past 2020 on to 2030. And renewable energy was dismissed slightly, has not been able to contribute too much. But it's worth pointing out that right now Nigeria is generating roughly about 4,000 megawatts. And the RAI PPP delivered 4 megawatts in about 2.5 years, which I think succinctly proves the possibility of this. Now, other aspects of success, and I think this argument is one which has to be continuously made by everybody about what renewable energy can do and how fast it can be put in place. The other aspects which strike us are the big cost reductions my colleague has alluded to. Across all the technologies, the prices really came down. And in the case of PV, I think the photovoltaics in the last round, it actually came down to just under $2 per watt peak. The total investment was about $14 billion, of which 29% came from outside South Africa. And I think that may have been fairly unique to South Africa because it has a very deep financial market and has excellent advisory services, legal, accounting, and also connections with other financial markets worldwide. The third noteworthy area, I would say, is the way the program actually has tried to lever on the investment to create community benefits, not just the immediate communities, like say radius of 50 kilometers, but the whole society. There's been a job content definition, and that's increased, doubled since the start. They've been concerned with local industrialization. They measure the jobs, both the temporary jobs and the long-term jobs which have been created. And this, of course, has not been entirely popular with the firms which have been bidding for the jobs, but nevertheless, it has stimulated, it has appealed to the government and to the mass of people, because you must respond to population needs, especially in a place like Africa where there's such a high rate of population growth. I think that's enough at this moment.
Thank you, Anthony. Ayanda from the state-owned entity ESCOM, the power utility, the program has a very deep sense of stakeholder engagement and community involvement, including the socio-economic impact. So can you touch upon that for us and how we've gone about doing that in the program, but also to add from ESCOM's perspective, how we've been able to integrate the renewable energy program into the grid?
Thank you for the opportunity of sharing the lessons learned from South Africa. I'm from ESCOM, which is a utilities-owned state. It supplies 95% and subsequently 45% for the continent. If we talk renewable technology that is grid-tied, obviously it has got to happen on the strength of the local utility, because it's the utility that will then be the PPA holder for all of those projects that are being run. And what we have done very well in South Africa is to ensure that the program is underwritten by government. So while ESCOM as a utility is seen as a credible PPA holder, it had to be underwritten by government to ensure that the program is successful. And this obviously involves investments in the grid, as you have higher penetration of renewables in the system. And we have connected all of them successfully, and our grid is stable, and we are working on making more and more investments so that we can catch up with the rollout that is going to take place. Other than that, we did create an environment for the international investors that wanted to come into the country. We ensured also that the program is based on local currency, because as we understand that African countries, majority of them are exposed to exchange rate fluctuations. And in order to avoid all of that, it has been made, is fixed in terms of the local currency, which is the rand. And also as a utility, then we had to ensure that there is fair and equitable access into the grid. Everybody else can access the grid. And in the event that the utility is not in a position to do it, we offer self-build option to the developers should they wish to follow that aspect. The plan that the country also created, it was through a public consultation process where we involved all the public to give input in informing this integrated resource plan that was there, to ensure that it captures all the views of the stakeholders, and that was published successfully by government. And one of the excellent things that we did was the regulatory framework, which all the investors look for when they come into the country, and they also look for a multi-year disciplinary process in terms of your tariffs. And we publish a tariffs for the 5 years so that any investor can see the tariffs of the country where they are going. So that's the space and that's the role the utility plays by publishing and ensuring that that tariff path is known by the investors, because also when the price becomes too low, it becomes a barrier to them. But that price path helps the investors a lot, and that's the contribution that we have made.
Thank you. And now we come to a part where we see the actual manufacturers and developers doing and executing these projects in South Africa. The program also looks at the 70-30, in which is run by the Department of Energy and the IPP office, but at the DTI, we also provided a level of support for manufacturing, to stimulate manufacturing in the country. So, Vinu, from your perspective, from SunPower's perspective, as a manufacturer in the country, how has this program been successful? How is the opportunities for manufacturing in South Africa, and how do you look forward to a future program in South Africa, and what has been your experience coming into a particularly new program in South Africa?
Thank you, Yunus. If I can take a few minutes to, introduce the company, because I think, Yunus has clubbed me into the manufacturing sort of silo, but SunPower is, is a vertically integrated solar company, have been in business for 30 years, which is saying something in this, pretty new field and changing field. We do everything from manufacturing, essentially, all the way to development and owning assets. And we continue to remain and have remained a technology leader in this field over the 30 years of our existence. We are also a global company because we operate in various other markets other than the U.S., which is our where we are based. We are also essentially a large partner essentially and a large shareholder in SunPower is Total, who have a major essentially footprint which we hope to leverage as we go more international, and specifically for Africa, because it's very important, as Total's footprint in Africa is something essentially that is unparalleled in my view. Having said that, we have been in South Africa for a number of years. We have participated with different levels of success, I would say, through round 1 to now round 4C. We have had projects we won in a few rounds, we lost a few rounds, but we took an early essentially decision to have a manufacturing base. It's really a MODCO essentially that we have in the country. And it has obviously helped us immensely with respect to the fact of meeting the requirements of the process that essentially was put out by the regulatory authorities. But I think it goes a little bit beyond that, because I think essentially having manufacturing in a country is huge with respect to essentially not only going through bids and not only going through essentially winning bids and executing on the projects, but really building skill sets. It's from manufacturing that you start building skill sets. I must say, over the period of essentially the last 5 to 6 years through this process, it has been a challenge too. I want to make sure that everybody does understand that having the manufacturing, and anyone in the manufacturing business will adhere to that, it's a challenge, because a manufacturing unit is different to essentially just a development which could be one-off, but a manufacturing unit really needs essentially a commitment and a flow of orders to keep it essentially occupied. So I do think that as we move forward with what has been an extremely successful program as far as South Africa is concerned, and I want to emphasize that it's probably, I've spent more than 25 years in the electricity sector, and it's been one of the more successful essentially programs that I have seen around the world, mainly in developing markets. And I hope will remain essentially something that every other country and every other developing market will look towards to essentially follow. But I think as the policymakers and the government start looking at the next step and say what next from here, I do hope essentially there is more thought given to players who are investing a little bit beyond the shorter term and see how that manufacturing side of the business can be sustained. And I think that would be a challenge for all of us, including the government. But I hope that's something that we will be looking into as a learning experience from this successful round.
Thank you. Peter, from Sky Power of Canada, as a developer from round 1, how has the program evolved, and how have companies, for example, been able to reach financial closure? And what has been your experience as a developer in South Africa?
Thank you, Eunice. Ladies and gentlemen, generally the last guy in the room gets to say, my answer to that question is everything that they've said. So thank you for that, Eunice. It makes me seem more intelligent than I actually am. At the end of the day, the organization that I represent here this afternoon is an organization called Sky Power Global. And to put it very succinctly, we are a developer and an investor, specifically into solar photovoltaic plants. We are active in 35 countries, and I'm fortunate enough to say that 12 of those countries are on the African continent. In terms of our approach and our process to answer Eunice's question about how the process has evolved, I think it's important for us to go back to the beginning of the process, to take a look at the reasoning behind why the South African government took the position that it took. And essentially, we come up with 4 ideas in our assessment. Number 1, the government wanted to diversify away from a single utility, and they did this by introducing the regulation, the policy, the framework that then allowed independent power producers to come into the process. Government was interested in a transparent, and importantly, as my colleagues were saying, long-term process that they could use to understand how the price of the acquisition of electricity and power would reduce over time. Number three, there is very clearly a characteristic in the South African marketplace in terms of how we generate electricity that calls for a commitment in terms of a carbon reduction program, and the REIPP was part of, I believe, the government's solution to the thinking. And then number four, again, like my colleagues have mentioned this afternoon, this was about a long-term process for job creation. If we take those four reasonings behind how the South African marketplace was originally put in place, and we understand that the initial mouthings of this particular program, even though it kicked off in the middle of 2011, probably go back 4 or 5 years to 2006 and 2007 to get them into a state to be able to deliver on this program. If we take a look at the characteristics of the particular process, which then leads us to determine how things like financial close, how things like commissioning dates are changing and being modified and being optimized to address the program, we can talk about this in terms of 5 things. Number one, government knew that in order to support private investment into the process, what they would have to do is signal the market over a long-term period through effective and stable policies. That much is clear in the South African marketplace. Number two, they had to build the systems to allow the developers such as ourselves and the key stakeholders to enter the market and to have an understanding of where they needed to be in that particular market. One project in South Africa at this moment in time has groupings of up to 23 stakeholders. That is massive, folks. It's massive to be able to sit there and figure out, as the Department of Energy, how do you get these groups of people to talk to each other with the same goal in mind? That then goes full circle to make sure you've got the policies in place. Number three, the market, by the time that the REIPP program was undertaken, was ready for this. It was ready for this because there are at least 4 previously not potentially successful processes that were put in place to continuously signal the market what is coming at you. By the time that the REIPP program was launched, private investors, government, through the various departments, trade of industry, banks, EPC contractors, professional advisors, we were all ready for this thing to roll out. I think that's one of the important lessons that we can take from the process. And I think it's also a lesson that can feed through into what happened in the financial close and the commissioning debate. If your stakeholders are not ready for that particular process, don't have an understanding of what is required, then those projects will not be successful. The fact that they have been successful in their financial closes, the fact that they have been successful largely in terms of their commissioning dates, the fact that Eskom has been able to connect these organizations to the grid shows that it's that long-term thinking that starts out with policy reasoning that's made sense in South Africa. If we talk about where we are at the moment, number one, the process is fair and transparent. We know as a developer exactly what we need to do, and we're not alone in the space. Every stakeholder in that situation knows what they need to do and where they need to aim for. And then the most important thing for us is that the system that was created allowed us to engage with this documentation that we call a bankable PPA. From a commercial point of view, which is my stance in the process, and I've got about 30 seconds left, the most important thing is to be able to determine how much money are we going to lose. Can we cap that to a number, if it makes any sense? Or, alternatively, how much money do we stand to make, and what are the risks associated with that contractual obligation? The fact that the South Africans created a bankable PPA is, for us, one of the important lessons that then leads into how organizations develop their approaches to financial close. It's a response to a contract. And how it's developed their approach to commissioning those particular projects on an effective timeline. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Okay, I'll throw one question out to the 5 panelists. Having gone through the 4 rounds of bidding, what would you like to see happening from a company's perspective in the future rounds? One, and then each one of you can comment on that. Or what would you like to see government doing in terms of the future of the renewable energy program? Or what are the applications that we've been successful thus far and which ones we can scale up. So in that order, the five of you can quickly comment on that, and then we will open the floor for questions. Mike?
Sure, thanks. Maybe I'll touch on some of the investments in manufacturing that's happened in South Africa as a result of this program, and how that's been successful. So there are a couple of really well-recognized international companies that have established manufacturing in South Africa. Companies like Jinko, SMA, Gestamp Renewables, SunPower, are all operating and manufacturing components to support the renewable energy industry in South Africa. That's kind of a direct response to the requirement for local content in the bidding rules. As those requirements are steadily increased round on round, we see an increased opportunity for manufacturing to establish in South Africa. I think that's a real success that the country can build on, and it's a real success for looking at the lessons for other African countries, that if you can capture large portions of the value chain into your economy, you're justifying your procurements of renewable energies for economic reasons as well as just the financial reasons of getting cheap electricity onto the grid. And I think that the big lesson for the country is that it really is about building an industry and about building jobs in South Africa focused in this sector, rather than just finding the quickest route to signing power purchase agreements. Thanks.
Anthony?
Since the program has been successful in being so fast and so big, I would suggest that the target, 2030 target, be raised to have a higher proportion. Secondly, I think there should be a continuous assurance of an annual build-up of the requirement for renewable energy in order to do two or three things. One, of course, is to give assurance to manufacturing companies who are there that there's a future there. Secondly, to enable indigenous capacity to build up. Already there are signs not only of the basic takeaways like skills having developed for rooftop installations and so on, but at a deeper level, for example, the University of Johannesburg, which has made some world-breaking discoveries and which have led to commercialization in thin film, and which was sold, for example, to a German company, and which has now been piloted there, and they're looking to export that elsewhere in the world. So you see that South Africa has the potential to be a launching pad for exports. And not just, it's a fact, it's already happening. The companies who have established there have already started developing projects in other African countries. And it doesn't have to be just Africa. They have the technology, the excellent educational system, which will enable them to take this out to the Middle East and to Europe as well.
Ayana?
Each and every country, when it adopts and rolls out renewables technology, it has got specific strategies and reasons why it's doing that. But I think all countries will have and will face socio-economic objectives which are different from country to country. And having said that, renewables has assisted South Africa in terms of the security of supply, and that has happened very well. We have seen the plants assisting and addressing the energy constraints that we have. And going forward, we then have got to invest more and more in terms of the grid to be able to bring these plants. And having said that, we also need to start working more on socio-economic objectives. Because while there is still electricity needs that we're addressing, we still have the economy that we still need to grow, and we need to grow more and more of this and start involving some local players along this value chain that is there. And we start focusing on technology transfer so that also the local players, they are able and they are capacitated to be able to create these technologies locally. And I think University of Johannesburg have just quoted, and those are the kinds of things that we would like to see going forward. And obviously, with more rollout of renewables, you need to have backup supply, and gas presents an excellent opportunity that you couple up with renewables going forward and build more plants with a high penetration of renewables, not to expose the system. So we see that then renewables will move along with gas so that the system can remain stable going forward.
Thank you. Obviously, I think with such a successful program, I would say do more. It's pretty obvious. I think essentially, one of the key factors that we have not talked about and which is very important from South Africa perspective is a large part of that success has really been because of the banks and the financial institutions in South Africa, which really have stepped up, in my view, to make this a success. And I think that depth of financing and the depth of financial institutions is a key takeaway with respect to any country essentially going out and looking to emulate South African process. There will be, as we go ahead and do more, hopefully on the process, there will be more of a learning curve. The banks, there will be issues on credit, but I think there is a lot of scope, both from the perspective of essentially the grid and ESCOM to, buy, to do much more in the renewable space in South Africa in the coming years. So that's great. From a manufacturing perspective, I think, someone touched upon it, I think it was Mike. I think it is important to encourage that because fundamentally, if you look at how South Africa is positioned, if you attract manufacturing into the country at this point of time, hopefully that will serve as a hub going forward to many other places on the continent. Because on an individual country basis, it may not be possible to have essentially manufacturing in every country in Africa. So there will be, few places that are chosen and that will act as essentially export hubs. But for that, we need to make sure that those essentially investments survive and thrive. So I think there is, we are looking at the government and saying, don't forget, the second part of the objective, which you have essentially, I think aptly touched upon, which is there is something beyond just, the power plants. And the last part would be, as you look at the program, maybe in terms of maturity of the program as far as South Africa is concerned, it's time, I think, for the regulators and others to really look at the smaller side of the sector, which is essentially, going from the grid connected, which is successful, which is established, which is well understood, to, the second phase, which is really, can you have commercial and residential entities and large loads being connected directly through, renewable power? Can there be a process for bilateral, essentially, PPAs? Most of these don't take off because of credit enhancement. Would the government look at options to credit enhance those kind of essentially, PPAs? So I think it's exciting times in the future for South African, renewable program. And, we are pretty excited about it.
Peter?
I think, Eunice, my answer is fairly simple, and it's based on the fact that we're a commercial organization working in this particular environment. I think that the takeaway and the look forward is potentially that the rollout of solar photovoltaic and the rollout of renewables is a leading indicator. Number one, it's a leading indicator for things like the grid structure and the grid shape of things to come. Number two, it's a leading indicator for the smaller, more dispersed and diversified generation possibilities on the continent. And number three, I actually believe that it's a leading indicator for how we will address the next potential crisis that is coming at us, which is water. I think it has the potential to follow a similar process. In terms of the takeaway as to where we'd like to see the market go from a South African perspective, as well as being a commercial organization, I'm also very proudly a South African. I would like to see us take the bull by the horns and meet the Americans somewhere in the middle of the continent, with us taking what we know and understand about our own home into the African continent. Why not lead by Team South Africa?
Thank you. I think maybe there's a gentleman has his hand raised for a while. Maybe we go to the questions. If you can maybe just stand up and just tell us what is your name and the company, and very brief on the question. Oh, okay. Are they, yeah, Here we go.
Shall I stand up? Okay. Thank you very much. I think this was very impressive. Stefan Singer, WWF International, Director Global Energy Policy. And you might know some of our folks working with you in South Africa. From our perspective, from WWF International, I think the South African model, the South African experience of doing renewables as a policy statement is fantastic. So we support you in principle, and we're happy to work with you. I think one thing needs to be added, what Michael has said correctly in the beginning, and I come back on my question on that one. I think it was worthwhile to say that the last bidding process resulted also, in addition to the strong declines of costs and prices for wind and solar, that wind and solar, based on the bidding process, unsubsidized, is now cheaper than domestic coal on a kilowatt-hour basis. South Africa is investing since 4 years, about 1% of its GDP equivalent into renewables, much more than the usual suspects like Germany, China, US. I think we need to keep that in mind, and that's congratulations to you guys. My question to you is, given the, what we call very dangerous deal your government has done with the Russians on 10 gigawatt nuclear with Rosatom, nothing has happened so far. Do you believe, or do you think that the increasing advantages of renewables in your country, the ongoing processes in renewables, will outcompete the potential deal with Rosatom and make it unnecessary to erect 10 gigawatt nuclear in your country? Just from economic reasons.
Ayanda, you can respond.
Stefan, who would you like to answer that question?
Okay.
Stefan, who would you like to answer that question? I'm sure that we're going to have varied opinions of that.
Okay, Ayanda, let's go.
Look, yes, there are good benefits, excellent benefits in terms of renewables, but what the country has done, it has made a policy decision to diversify the energy mix. So it's about diversification of the energy mix, and it is not to downplay the benefits of renewables. And in that diversification of the energy mix, it then includes things like nuclear, includes gas, includes renewables, includes clean coal. And that's the stance that the country has taken. And yes, it will differ also in how and how long the other technologies are implemented, but there are excellent benefits for renewables, quick execution, but the policy was on diversification of the energy mix, and not to say renewables doesn't give the benefits to the country. It does, but the country is driving the strategy of diversification, and hence we are hearing about the nuclear.
Okay.
And if I can jump in there as well, Stefan, and address the question on nuclear. It's been my experience that this particular program is run on the basis of a model that says, let's look at where we are now, and then the let's look at where we are now question is continuously asked and answered as time goes by. I do not believe that because we have an impending deal with the Russians or the various countries that are involved in the nuclear energy, that we will necessarily end up in a dangerous over-nuclearized process. I believe that the government, specifically the Department of Energy and National Treasury, is very well aware of the fact that if we're going to get into that particular space, it's going to be because we are lacking in terms of the baseload capacity of the country. I think it's an option that the country is looking at, and I don't think what they're doing is throwing anything out, including the baby with the bathwater. I think what they're doing is taking a very careful and considered look to say, let's continuously assess it and not throw away any of the options that are currently available.
Thank you. Any questions? One at the back.
Hi, thank you all. Mohammed Jawad from the Islamic Development Bank group. My question is relating to other success stories in the sub-Saharan Africa region. Do you see any other rising stars in the horizon? And then my question perhaps is to Mr. Anthony and Mr. Venue and Mr. Peter. Based on your experience and your view of the market today, do you see other opportunities?
Anthony?
You were asking about other opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, correct? Yes. The short answer is yes. And, I emphasized in my introduction with respect to the fact that, we are lucky, frankly, to have a large shareholder in Total who has a huge footprint as far as sub-Saharan Africa is concerned. And we see the opportunities in many countries. And Peter have talked about, they are in 14 countries and 12 of those are in Africa. So Africa is just a huge potential. And you would find a continent that actually jump-started and, went, frankly, in telecom sector, someone was making an example yesterday. It went directly into mobile, and actually a mobile payment, online payment is essentially pioneered in Africa rather than another part of the world. We see solar playing a similar role as far as Africa is concerned. Now, is it going to be, is it going to be grid mounted in all the places? Is it going to be the grid essentially reaching it first, or is it going to be distributed? We can discuss the different business models that will be followed in different countries. But I think what South African process has done is it has, I think, put renewables in Africa on the map. I really think the success of the South African program has made it, that every other country looks at it and says, we should have something like this. Now, it's not necessary to be exactly the same program, but it will be different because of the size of the country and the needs of the country and the grid and all other considerations. But I just see this being probably the largest market on a long-term basis for renewables, I think, in the world, I would say, just because of the need, and it's just because of the quick, you can actually put this and you can generate electricity very quickly in comparison to something like a nuclear, which, I didn't comment on it, but I would say it's fine to have that going, on the parallel as long as the renewable program is not essentially gets killed, because I think the renewables will prevail. By the time the nuclear plant is up and running, the renewables would have prevailed. So I see a lot of opportunities. We see a lot of opportunities, and I'm sure Peter would agree to that.
Anthony?
Very much so.
I think there's a huge opportunity, market opportunity in Africa. A lot of it comes from the opportunity to displace the burning of diesel fuel, which is widespread, both for intensive industries such as mining, etc., but also in dense urban areas as well. And of course, off-grid, telecom towers. In India and in Nigeria, that accounts for quite a sizable amount of fuel being used for your telecom sector, and also has foreign exchange implications. In order for that to work, though, I think certain countries will have to consider a hybrid of using a procurement system like the South African one, where there are economies of scale, but also feed-in tariffs to encourage rooftop and community systems. And the final thing there would be simply also to tie in climate change funding to come into that and integrate, well, when I say integrate, not in a huge manner, but you do want to have the fact that the grid-type program is likely to expand far faster than a standalone system. So you really, I think, want to convert some of the 30% weighting for community purposes to support long-term capacity building for standalone systems. And you need to take that across. For regional development, you need to be supporting specific business models, such as pay-as-you-go models, which have shown great growth, and mini-grids. And of course, we are in a context where we now have very low oil prices, which may persist for a long time. So that, of course, will impel people to use diesel generators longer and more. So we have to consider, again, this is where a feed-in tariff comes in, an incentive to make people, to inspire people to use renewable energy sources despite the low prices right now, in order to meet national commitments which were signed at COP21.
Peter, you want to add something?
Thanks, Eunice. I think Venu and Anthony have identified the main characteristics of what we would say market readiness is in a particular country. I don't think I can add anything to that, other than to say that in our commercial models, there are the 12 countries that we think are at a stage. Some are early, some are more developed and a little bit more mature, but there are 12 countries that are interesting in terms of what we can learn from the South African model.
Mike, can you just expand on what we are looking at in terms of the special economic zone in the Western Cape and in the Northern Cape for the attraction of investment into these areas?
Sure. So the plan is basically to have two special economic zones that have got a focus on green technology. The first is in the Northern Cape, and that'll have a specific focus on solar photovoltaic. The Northern Cape is an area in South Africa that is blessed with some of the highest irradiance in the world, and is the sort of place that the majority of the solar projects have been built. The program that we're looking at in the Western Cape is really to take an existing industrial area and convert it into a green technology cluster. There's quite a lot of available land, and we've submitted an application through to the DTI and the receiver of revenue in South Africa to have a decreased corporate tax rate, and then a bunch of other incentives for direct foreign investment. There's some signs of early success. There's been about 500 million rand already invested in that special economic zone, and that's really across wind turbine towers, some geotextiles, some insulation materials. But the intention is really to turn that piece of land into a world-leading clean tech manufacturing zone that will service largely the South African renewable energy market, but looking at servicing the rest of sub-Saharan Africa using that as a base. We're hoping to have everything finalized by about the middle of this year. But right now there are currently opportunities. If anyone is interested, you're welcome to speak to me.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Each of the five of you guys, in a few seconds, final comments?
Should I start?
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, happy to start again. I think Peter mentioned these multiple stakeholders of 22 or 23 stakeholders that are required to build and develop a successful project. I think the biggest lesson from South Africa is the willingness of each of those departments to engage, to listen to industry, to listen to each other, and to try and figure out how to solve this real Gordian knot of issues to develop a successful project. And the lesson that I would like to really highlight is that the patience, the determination, the ongoing engagement from all of the stakeholders is really the thing that's allowed the South African program to succeed. Yes.
Anthony?
Yeah. There are five, for me, big lessons. First of all, there are no white elephants. Every project was delivered. The method tying in equity, loan financing, which had been fully underwritten, meant that the suppliers could not game the system, bid low and then try and renegotiate. So all those projects worked. The other aspect of that was there was no project which was too big. They were limited to about 75 megawatts, say, for a PV in each case. So again, the prospect of catastrophic failure could not be a danger. I can think of some countries in Africa where we have heard that they have signed agreements over 1 gig, and you wonder whether if they actually went through, what would be left for other people and what could be the risks, and could they actually afford failure in this, so no white elephants first. Then two, leveraging community benefits, making sure that these guys who are going to gain money actually put something to the community, because it's not their natural inclination to do it, especially if they're foreigners, non-African, they're not really keen to do that. Then the strong delivery, that's a third point, of the team, the ad hoc team from the Department of Energy and also the National Treasury, which did superb work producing excellent documents beforehand and the concept. Then they summoned the initial meeting, which had about 300 attendees, stakeholders, many of them bidders. And against the background of skepticism and of government, they tried again, and disappointment in the previous feed-in tariff regime, they now had sufficient faith. They had created enough of an incentive and confidence in the private sector to come through, and that happened. Then finally, I would say fast and skillful PPPs, necessary, and strategic alignments. That's where we are now. In the World Future Energy Summit discussions, we've been talking about how to make strong partnerships. And these partnerships actually, the need to do things by way of global partnerships and also at local level has come through in the last year with Sustainable Development Goals agreed in New York, the third quarter of last year, the COP21 in France in December, and this gathering this time, which is the first major gathering since then. So it's how we go forward to realize, with the help of Master and others here, making a practical success and huge jump in Africa.
Quickly on my side, the biggest lesson that I think we could share with other countries, renewables allows us to reduce climate change, but I think the key fundamental thing while renewables addresses electricity needs is the growth of the economy of the developing countries. And we need to be very clear when we roll out renewables that it is not just electricity needs, but is the growth of our economies. And those economies differ from country to country, and we need to define what it means for our country when we deploy these technologies. Because at the end of the day, our economy needs to grow, we need skills development, we need jobs, so that all the developing countries also start growing up. And that's the biggest message that I would like to share, that ensure that it addresses your socio-economic objectives, because that is what will grow the economy, while obviously it is addressing your electricity needs.
Well, we hope to continue our partnership with South Africa and hope we will be successful in doing so over the coming decades.
For us, it's about spending the time to focus in a collaborative manner. That's what will turn the continent into an investment destination. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give this esteemed panel a round of applause?